The word racist is one of the worst things that you can be called. But more and more often, I would ask you to consider whether that word and the meaning of that word has been diluted by these narratives that were being fed by the media. What I want to show is a few graphics that, oh my God, absolutely speak volumes for what's going on. So this first one explains and it shows visually how often the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post used the word racist or racism in coverage over the years. And what, again, tabletmag.com found is that use of the words racist, racists, and racism increased by over 700% for the New York Times and 1,000% by the Washington Post between 2011 and 2019. Think about that for a moment. Do you think that racism has increased by 700% or 1,000% between 2011 and 2019? Of course not. But the usage of those phrases in some of the largest newspapers in the country and the world increased exponentially. So this one has to do with use of the words white privilege, whiteness, racial hierarchy, which, what does that mean? And white supremacy. So again, a very, very similar pattern where you have in some instances a 1,500% increase in the use of those words between 2013 and 2019. Again, do you think that there's been, a 1,500% increase in instances of white privilege? No, it's that the media invented that word, or some activist somewhere invented the word white privilege, and then they just shoved it down our throats like never before. Okay, we'll keep moving on in these graphics because it's all coming to a point about what this sort of reporting in the media does to the rest of us. So they did another graphic that had to do with the words systemic or structural racism and racial inequality or racial disparity. And again, you see a 1,000% increase between 2013 and 2019 in entities like the New York Times and the Washington Post for those types of words. So then, again, Tablet Mag looks at how did that influence people's perception of racism and racial issues. So let me show you this next chart. There was a question, just the general question, do you know anyone who you would consider a racist or not? And so it looks at it so the blue is 2006, polls that asked that question in 2006, and then green is 2015, okay? For white Democrats, that jumped from 45% saying, yes, I do, in 2006, to 64% in 2015 saying, yes, I know someone who I would consider a racist. So I would ask you, have they just expanded for white Democrats based on media coverage, their definition of what they consider a racist to be? That seems like the likely scenario, that they were fed so much by these major media institutions about race and racism and white supremacy that you had white Democrats who expanded their definition of racism, so much so that a majority of white Democrats would say, I know someone who I believe is racist. Okay, one more slide I want to get to, and I think this one is the most telling of all of them. The question is, how big of a problem is racism in the U.S. today? Is it a big problem, somewhat of a problem, a small problem, or not a problem at all? You'll see around 2010, you had people who were really thinking, we're doing okay in the United States of America. I don't consider it a huge problem. So in 2011, just 35% of white liberals thought racism was a big problem in the United States. In 2015, that number was up to 61%. And in 2017, that went up to 77%. In 2017, 77% of white liberals considered racism in the U.S. a big problem compared to just 35% in 2011. Now, are we really to believe that racism got that much worse in the US from 2011 to 2017? Of course not. But what you're seeing reflected there is a reflection of the increase in talk of racism, white supremacy, institutional racism, et cetera, that was used in the largest, the most circulated newspapers in the country. And I think what that shows you, and it's our sanity check for a reason today, because I think some of us might be like questioning our own sanity when we look at all the media outlets and the conversations that try to convince us that we're a racist country and that our neighbors are racist and that Republicans are racist. The media did that to us. The media makes us feel that way. The media makes people question whether they're racist, whether they're white supremacists, whether they have white privilege. And it's because in some cases, 1,500% more references to issues of racism and white privilege and white supremacy over a span of like 10 years in this country. The media is responsible for so many of the divisions that are happening in our country and for making us feel like we have to dislike one another, for making us think so little of our friends and our family and our neighbors, for making people expand their definitions of who's a racist. The word racist is one of the worst things that you can be called. But more and more often, I would ask you to consider whether that word and the meaning of that word has been diluted by these narratives that were being fed by the media. And I believe that the answer is yes.